You might assume procrastination is just poor time management. You might label yourself lazy, undisciplined, or lacking motivation. But what if the real reason you can't begin or finish things isn't about productivity at all? What if it has less to do with time and more to do with your past? Because for many, procrastination isn't the root issue. It's a symptom, a quiet, hidden echo of childhood shame, not shame about what you did, but about who you were taught not to be. Today, let's explore what Carl Jung revealed about this, why the fear of visibility runs so deep, and how healing that fear might be the key not just to progress, but to finally feeling free to live. Chapter 1. Shame begins when you're told you're too much. We often think shame arises from doing something wrong, but the shame that shapes your adult life usually doesn't come from a single moment. It comes from being made to feel that your very self was unacceptable. And it begins early, so early that you may not even recognize how deeply it's imprinted on your identity. You were likely just being yourself, maybe curious, energetic, deeply emotional. Maybe you cried easily or laughed loudly or dreamed big with an untamed imagination. And then someone responded. Maybe they told you to settle down, grow up, stop being dramatic. Or maybe they didn't speak at all, just gave you a look, withdrew warmth, or turned cold when you needed connection. And you didn't understand why. You only knew that being yourself seemed to upset others, that being seen, being heard, being real brought discomfort, and for a child, discomfort equals danger. Carl Jung believed that what we push away in childhood doesn't vanish. It sinks into the unconscious. It forms part of the shadow, the hidden, suppressed pieces of us that still influence our actions from behind the scenes. He said, "The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem and the epitome of a whole outlook on life." But how can you accept yourself when you were taught early on that your essence was flawed? So you adjusted. You tried to become more likable. You smiled when you felt sad. You kept quiet even when you wanted to speak up. You shrank, you tiptoed, you became more acceptable, and this self-editing eventually became second nature. You stopped noticing, but your nervous system didn't. It remembers. Shame doesn't always arrive loudly. It often hides in silence. It shows up in small hesitations, in the pause before you speak your mind, in the way you hold back ideas, in the way you delay action. Not due to lack of talent, but because deep down, some part of you still fears judgment. Jung also said, "We cannot change anything unless we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses." And so many people judge themselves for procrastinating without realizing what they're actually reacting to. Because shame stores memory. Even if your adult self seems past it, your emotional body remembers that first punishment for being authentic. That memory lingers, shaping your connection to expression, effort, and success. It's no wonder the things you desire most, freedom to create, recognition, self-trust, also feel terrifying because they demand visibility, and visibility once meant pain. Think about the things you've put off, not because you didn't care, but because you cared too much, so much that it felt risky. Deep within, a part of you remembers, being fully myself wasn't safe. So procrastination becomes your body's quiet way of saying, not yet. It doesn't trust you'll be met with safety or approval. And this is where procrastination is born, not from apathy, but from fear. Fear rooted in moments when you were labeled too loud, too sensitive, too intense, too emotional, just too much. And instead of questioning their reaction, you began to question yourself. That's the nature of shame. It turns the harm you experienced into self-blame. It convinces you that hiding is wise, that silence is safer, that not trying is better than risking rejection. But what if you weren't too much? What if you were never too much? What if you were just deeply alive, and those around you didn't know how to receive that aliveness? What if your procrastination isn't a fault, but a message? a signal from the part of you that still fears that being seen will cost you love. Jung taught that healing comes through integration, by bringing the shadow into the light. He saw the disowned parts of ourselves not as problems, but as paths to healing. So next time you find yourself hesitating, delaying, avoiding, pause. Not to scold yourself, but to ask, what part of me feels scared right now, and what does that part remember? That's where healing begins, not by forcing yourself to do more, but by listening more closely. Not through punishing an action, but by reclaiming the pieces of you that once felt unsafe to be seen. Chapter 2. Procrastination as Emotional Protection. We tend to view procrastination as a weakness, a lack of discipline, poor habits, bad routines. But under the surface, procrastination is rarely about laziness. It's a nervous system's response, a quiet defense mechanism trying to shield you from something that once felt overwhelming or unsafe. On the surface, it seems innocent. You delay a task, tell yourself you'll do it later, but later keeps moving. Your list grows, and underneath it all, a deeper pattern is unfolding, because often, the task you're avoiding isn't just about work. It's about vulnerability, meaning, identity. It holds emotional weight, and for many, the real risk isn't failure. It's being seen. You might avoid writing, not because it's hard, but because sharing your truth still feels too raw. You might not finish that project, not because you don't care, but because someone might judge the final result. You might avoid starting something new not from laziness, but because you still carry the belief that no matter what you do, it won't be enough. Carl Jung said, "What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size." Procrastination is often that resistance, not to work, but to exposure, to the risks of being visible, of being evaluated, or even being praised. Because for many, praise can be just as terrifying as critique, especially if you were raised feeling undeserving of attention or affirmation. So, what looks like disinterest is often self-protection. What seems like a lack of discipline is often a deep nervous system wound. What you call procrastination is often your inner child pulling the brakes, afraid that effort will bring pain. This perspective doesn't excuse inaction. It reframes it. It invites compassion, curiosity, and it offers a path, not through pushing harder, but through gentler inquiry. What does this task represent? What fear is it awakening? What memory is it touching? And most importantly, can you meet that fear not with shame, but with understanding? You're not broken because you hesitate. You're not weak because you pause. You're simply someone whose body remembers. And healing doesn't mean never procrastinating again. It means no longer seeing your delay as a failure of character, but as a message worth listening to. The message is this: the part of you that waits, delays, avoids, is not your enemy. It's your protector, and when you learn to listen to it, hold space for it, work with it rather than against it, you begin to create safety within yourself, and from safety comes movement, not forced. Not panicked, but chosen, grounded, free. So the next time you're stuck, before you label yourself lazy or can ask, what part of me still thinks it's not safe to be seen? Because that's where change starts. Not with judgment, but with love. For many, the fear of failure feels real, but just as real, and sometimes even stronger, is the fear of success, because success means being seen, and being seen means attention. And for someone who grew up under watchful eyes, often judged or misunderstood, that kind of attention feels dangerous. So the mind learns a way to stay safe, delay. If I don't do it, I don't have to deal with what follows. If I never try, I can't fail. If I don't finish, it can't be judged. It's not logical, but it is protective. And the more you shame yourself for delaying, the more dangerous moving forward starts to feel. Jung understood this. He knew the mind defends itself, and procrastination is one of those defenses. Not obvious, not loud, but real. A subtle way to stay safe. You might not even know what you're afraid of. But your body does. It remembers rejection. It remembers humiliation, the silence that followed when you spoke your truth, and no one stayed. Now, when you're asked to act, your nervous system hesitates. That hesitation isn't weakness, it's history, it's memory. Somewhere along the line, you learned that effort could hurt. So your mind built a defense, a pause, a gap between you and the pain. That gap is what we call procrastination. But when we see procrastination for what it is, a survival instinct, it stops being a flaw. It becomes a message, a signal that something still doesn't feel safe, that some part of you still needs care. Not pressure, not punishment. You don't need to beat procrastination. You need to understand it. What part of you is afraid? What is it protecting? That's where healing begins, not with hacks, but with depth. With truth. Ask yourself, what does this task mean to me? What happens if I finish? Whose voice do I hear in my mind when I imagine it done? What am I still carrying about being visible? Jung once said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And that's what procrastination often is, a way to avoid facing the self, the fear, the history, the shame. But once you recognize it, you stop fighting it. You stop fighting you, and you begin to listen. To ask, what am I really afraid of? What still feels unsafe? Because when safety returns, so does motion. When acceptance is felt, hiding becomes unnecessary. And when being seen no longer feels like a threat, the work flows. The burden lightens, and you show up, not to survive, but to live. Chapter 3. The persona vs. the hidden self. As children, when we're judged or shamed for who we are, we adapt. We create masks, not physical ones, but the kind that show up in moments where we silence our truth to fit in. You want to speak honestly, but say what's polite. You want to express, but you filter. That mask is what Jung called the persona, the social self, the version you shaped to be liked, to be safe, to avoid conflict. It isn't fake, but it isn't the whole truth either. The persona helps you survive the world, but the problem begins when it's all you let people see. Procrastination, then, is often not about time, it's about identity. When the task in front of you asks for your real voice, your true creativity, your honest self, it collides with the persona, and the mask isn't sure if it's safe to drop. So you stall, you freeze, not because you don't want to finish, but because inside, two parts of you are clashing. One seeks approval, the other craves authenticity, and your nervous system doesn't know which one to choose. Maybe you're productive but disconnected. You get the work done, but your soul is missing. And over time, your energy fades, your spark dims, because your hidden self, your deeper self, isn't allowed into the process. And when that part is ignored long enough, it pushes back, it resists, it procrastinates. Not to sabotage, but to survive. Jung wrote, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." The world might reward the mask, but the self behind it is where your life lives. Ask yourself, when I delay, who am I trying to be? Did I choose this role, or did I create it just to survive? Because the mask may be efficient, but the self underneath, feeling messy, really is the source of your power. And when that self is buried, the work becomes lifeless. The delay becomes louder, not because you don't care, but because you can't fake it anymore. This is the cost of persona-driven life. You might succeed on paper, but feel lost inside. The deeper self doesn't want perfection. It wants truth, and when it's denied, procrastination becomes its only voice, a way of saying, I'm still here, I won't be buried again. So instead of pushing harder, listen. What part of you isn't being heard? What truth are you avoiding? What mask are you exhausted from wearing? Let a little of your true self in. Let it breathe. Let it speak. And the grip of procrastination will loosen. Jung didn't say become someone new. He said become fully yourself. The persona helped you survive, but the hidden self, that's where life begins. Chapter 4, The Shame. Shadow loop. It starts innocently. You set a goal, something small, like replying to a message, or something bigger, like starting a project that matters. At first, you feel ready, motivated, hopeful, but then something inside pulls you back, a weight, a fog, and suddenly you feel uncertain. Doubt creeps in. What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough? What if no one cares? So you avoid, you distract, you pause, and then guilt shows up. You didn't just delay the task, you start judging yourself. Now the shame grows deeper. You're not just someone who didn't do it. You become someone who never does it. That's the shame. Shadow loop. Jung called the shadow the part of us we reject, everything we don't want to face. Most people think that means anger, fear, envy, but it also includes shame, and shame doesn't shout, it whispers, it disguises itself. It sounds like, I'll do it later, or maybe this isn't that important, or I don't want to mess it up. That's the shadow talking. And every time you listen without understanding it, the loop repeats. You delay, you judge, you feel shame, and that shame feeds more delay. Round and round you go. But here's the truth. The shadow isn't the enemy. It's the doorway, and shame isn't weakness. It's unprocessed pain. Pain from being told you were wrong, not for what you did, but for who you were. And if you want to break the loop, you must stop asking, what's wrong with me? And start asking, what happened to me? Jung's work points the way. Not toward perfection, but toward wholeness. You won't beat the shame, shadow loop by pushing harder. You break it by meeting your shadow, listening to the voice underneath, the voice that once wanted to be seen, to be accepted, and learned that to be real was to be in danger. So now, when the loop begins again, when you pause, when you delay, when you feel yourself spiral, and stop, not to shame yourself, but to ask, what am I protecting? And what would it take to feel safe enough to show up? Because that's how you end the loop. Not by trying to be someone else, but by daring to be you. The true emotion at the core of procrastination is fear. It's rooted in shame, a deep, often hidden belief that you're not ready, not capable, not allowed to take up space in the way you truly want to. The loop begins when you start doing something meaningful. That very act threatens to surface the shame, and shame hates exposure. So the shadow steps in, using avoidance as protection. The logic becomes, if I don't finish, I can't be judged. If I don't speak, I can't be misunderstood. If I stay small, I keep the parts I feel ashamed of hidden. It seems safer, but avoidance feeds the shame. Delaying brings short relief, but long-term regret follows. You mourn the unused time, the missed chances, the dreams deferred, and these add more shame to carry. Jung said, what you resist not only persists but grows. Avoiding your shame gives it power, making it the lens through which you see yourself and your future. This loop not only keeps you stuck, it reshapes your identity. You begin to see procrastination not as something you do, but as who you are. I never finish things. I ruin opportunities. I'm always behind. But these aren't truths. They're signals, signs of inner pain. Each time you try to move forward, that pain resurfaces. So how do you break the loop? Not through pressure or self-criticism, but through radical awareness. Notice the moment shame creeps in and ask, what is this really about? What am I afraid they'll see if I succeed? What part of me still believes visibility leads to rejection? These aren't productivity hacks. They're questions of identity. The loop ends not when the task is done, but when you feel safe enough to be seen. Jung believed healing comes not by imagining light, but by making the darkness conscious. That means the work begins not in the to-do list, but in understanding what's holding you back. When you're frozen, distracted, or stuck, pause. Ask what part of you is afraid, what it's protecting, what story it belongs to. Shame doesn't decide your future. The shadow doesn't control your potential. You do, and each moment of awareness reclaims a bit more of yourself. Chapter 5. Awareness is the first break in the pattern. Realizing that procrastination is a protective response, not laziness, shifts everything. It may begin subtly, a pause before you blame yourself, but that pause is the start of change. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Awareness interrupts the loop. When you recognize, "I'm not lazy, I'm afraid," you begin a powerful transformation, not by fixing, but by seeing, by meeting yourself with curiosity instead of criticism. Many people struggle to believe that awareness is enough because we've been trained to only value productivity. But healing begins not with doing, but with honesty, admitting that a task feels threatening, not because it's difficult, but because it touches a deeper fear of inadequacy. This awareness may come with grief, grief for years of feeling broken, grief for systems that tied your worth to perfection. Let that grief come. It means you're awake. Awareness doesn't erase procrastination overnight, but it lets you understand it. You begin asking, "What part of me feels unsafe right now?" You make space for that fear. Slowly, this breaks the link between shame and avoidance. You stop judging and start listening. And when you do, procrastination loses its grip, not through effort, but through compassion. Once seen clearly, it no longer owns you. Let's move forward and explore how small, safe actions can build new patterns. Patterns rooted in trust, not fear. Chapter 6. Reparenting the child who feared the spotlight. At some point in your early life, being seen became dangerous. You may have spoken too loudly, showed too much emotion, or simply expressed yourself. And someone reacted? Maybe they scolded, mocked, or ignored you. The message landed. Visibility leads to pain. That belief settled into your nervous system. Reparenting means offering safety and warmth to that wounded inner child. Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." This child needs full acceptance, not just of your calm, polished side, but of your raw, vibrant self. When you procrastinate, it's often this child pulling the brakes. Not out of defiance, but fear. The belief still lingers, "If I step out, I'll get hurt." So you wait, you hide. But what this child needs is reassurance. Not scolding, but soothing. Tell them, "I know why you're scared, but you're safe now. You don't disappear to be loved." Reparenting means adjusting your expectations too. You don't need to be fearless, just a little more kind each day. You don't need to do everything, just one small thing that proves safety. These tiny wins begin to separate past shame from present choices. You realize fear doesn't mean stop. It means go slowly with care. Jung reminded us that becoming who you are is life's greatest privilege. Reparenting reclaims that privilege, and over time, you procrastinate less. Not by force, but because you feel safe enough to move. Visibility stops being the enemy. Fear stops being the reason to hide. And you begin treating yourself as someone worth showing up for. Now, let's explore how procrastination shifts once you stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What do I need to feel safe enough to begin?" Chapter 7. Building a life where it's safe to be visible. This isn't just about mindset. It's about building a life, internally and externally, that allows you to be fully yourself. That might mean choosing environments that value progress over perfection. It might mean aligning your work with your true voice. Jung's idea of individuation is becoming who you truly are, not who you were told to be. Much procrastination fades when your work reflects your truth. You're no longer forcing action. You're following resonance. You're not performing. You're expressing. The goal isn't to crush procrastination, but to outgrow the self that needed to hide. You don't need to be fearless or healed, just willing. Procrastination weakens when you act despite fear. Jung said only the paradox gets close to life's fullness. You can be scared and still act, uncertain and still create, imperfect and still worthy of being seen. What feels like laziness is often a silenced dream, a voice afraid to speak. Let it speak. Let it be messy, honest, real. You're not behind, you're healing. And every small step forward reminds your nervous system visibility is no longer dangerous. You're in charge now. If this resonates, feel free to share your thoughts. You deserve to be seen, not when you're perfect, but exactly as you are.